Hello and welcome to another video about nuclear craft. Today we're going to look at the new fission reactors. I'm going to straight off this do a video on the new fusion reactors. As you can see, I had a bit of a disaster with a couple of them because I changed some configs around and I forgot to check on these reactors, and well, you can see that that's left a bit of a hole in the ground, which is quite annoying actually. It's even worse to deal with when you're actually at the scene of the crime because you've got loads of plasma flying about, but luckily it seems like it's been quite a while since this happened, and so I haven't had to deal with that. We'll speak about how that can happen in the next video, but today we're looking at fission. So fission's changed a huge amount. The first thing to say, by the way, the reason I'm not in full screen is because I've actually got my source code over here because I want to look through it to remember how this actually works. So the first thing to say is, even though these are like 5x5x5 and 3x3x3 reactors, a reactor can now actually be of any size at all. So let's just quickly just show that off. You can literally put a controller down anywhere. You can have a size and shape. As long as it's a cuboid, you can have any size, any shape you want. So for example, we could have ourselves a 3x2x1 reactor or whatever. Let's have a look. So you just basically make the reactor in the same way as you did before, except you can have it of any shape you want. And so we've got a 2x1x3 reactor. We can also put the controller over here. We can put the controller up here. Oh no, we can't put the controller there. I'll explain why you can't put the controller up there in a minute. It's a little bit confusing. You can also put the controller up here, and you should be able to. Yep, you can put it up there. You should be able to put it down there, yes. You can put it down there. You can put it pretty much anywhere as long as it's facing in the correct direction. I think you can even put it here. I think that should work as well. No, maybe not. Maybe here. No, maybe not either. The reason it can't is simply because at the moment the checking for the structure is a bit buggy. For some reason there's some weird bug at the moment where every time it's like on the right hand side of the reactor, it doesn't seem to be checking correctly. At the moment I'm trying to find the reason this is happening, and I really can't. But I'm hoping one day that I'll be able to actually work out where the issue is. But it should be able to work similarly to how the old reactors are, and I imagine people will still have the old structures, which are just cubes. As long as you put the fission controller roughly, in this position, it should be fine. But for now, in other positions, it's a little bit buggy. But don't worry about that. That should be fixed at some point in the future. But as I say, any shape will do. So that's the basics. The other thing to notice is there's no reactor upgrade anymore. That's disappeared. There's a few new things in here which we'll get to, like the number of cells, its efficiency, and we'll get to that now. The second thing to say is that the lag produced by fission reactors has decreased because I've now got a system where the reactor checks the structure every second or so. It's a config option for how many ticks it takes per structure check. But since it's once every 20 seconds, it produces a lot more lag by default. You can turn this down if you want to even more, so you can make it maybe check every 40 ticks, which is every 2 seconds, or every 5 seconds, or whatever, however you want. But obviously the smaller the number of ticks, the more regularly it's going to check, and the more sort of accurate it will be. Well, not more accurate, but just more sure of itself. It'll be more sure of what the structure is more often. So yeah, there we go. That's the structure. Now let's move on. Yeah, overheating. First of all, overheating. The way this works now is that, let me just scroll down here. The way that overheating works. Where is it? So the way that overheating works is it will, there was a little bug with this a couple of versions back, but it has been fixed now. The center of the explosion of overheating is right in the middle of the reactor, or roughly right in the middle of the reactor. Before there were some weird bugs with it. So it should be in the middle now, and the power of the explosion is roughly just the sum of the side lengths of the reactor, or the sum of the dimensions of the reactor. So for example, if I had a 5, sorry, so this is on the exterior. So if I have a 5x5x5 reactor in the middle, the actual size of the reactor is a 7x7x7, and so the explosion radius will be roughly 7 times 3, which is 21, and the explosion radius of this one, which is a 5 by 5 by 5 structure, will be roughly 15. It's roughly that. So that's the way to work out how big your explosion will be. As ever, the best way to protect from explosions is to use these blast resistant blocks. They can resist a nuke, so they should be able to resist any reactor meltdowns. And that's really the best way of keeping your base safe. It's no simpler than that. Right, let's move on. So now on to the thing that everyone wants to know about, which is power generation. That's changed quite a lot. So let's move down to the energy method. Okay, so power works very differently. In the old versions, you used to have a column of fuel cell compartments down the middle like this, and then you could put all your coolers and your graphite all around the edge. It doesn't work like that anymore. It's very, very different, in fact, actually. You can put the cells anywhere you want. You can literally have them dotted anywhere you want. Which is sort of similar to the way you can put down fuel cells in the IC2 reactors. You can basically just put them wherever you want. And similar again to IC2, if you have adjacent fuel cell compartments, then they will be more efficient, more fuel efficient, but they will also generate a lot more heat. So let's just look at an example of this in the 3x3x3, because it's just smaller and easier to look at. So first of all, if you complete the structure and there's no fuel cells, you'll see down here, cell 0, nothing's happening. And if we put a fuel in, let's just use LEU as an example. Let's put this in here. You'll see that there's no RF partic going to be generated. Nothing's going to happen. I need to get a lever as well. There you go. So yeah, nothing's going to happen if there's no cells in there. If I put one cell in here, you will see that I am now generating 300 RF per tick. Now how do you work out 300? Well, the base power of LEU fuel, if we look carefully, is 100 RF per tick. Now the way you work out how much actual power the reactor generates, not including graphite, is you do a very simple calculation. That calculation is the base RF, okay, which is 100, multiplied by, okay, so this is a little bit complicated, but we'll get to heat in a minute, because heat also now affects the power generation. But basically what you do is you just multiply the base power by the cube root of the side lengths of the reactor. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, what you do is you basically do this up here. You do 3 times 3 times 3, that's 27, and then you cube root that, that's 3. Okay, so for any cubic reactor, you literally just take the number here. If you had a 2x2x2 reactor, then the cube root of that would be 2. If you had a 3x5x4 reactor, then that's 60, and the cube root of 60 is roughly like 3.9 or something, I don't know off the top of my head. That's the multiple. So you multiply the base power of the fuel, you multiply that by the cube root of the multiple of all the side lengths, the interior side lengths, so in this case it's 3, and then multiplied by the number of cells you have. But it's slightly different from that, and I'll get to that right now. So in the basic situation where your cells are not touching each other, you literally just multiply the cube of the multiples of the sides times by the base fuel per tick and multiply by the cells. You can now see now there's 2 cells and we're generating 600 RF per tick. If I put another one in here, then we'll be generating 900 RF per tick. Okay. As for heat, we'll see here that the heat is 80. Why is that? Well, if we look at this, we can see here that the base heat is 80, and the way base heat is worked out when cells are not touching each other is you literally just multiply the base heat by the number of cells. The size of the reactor does not matter. So for one cell we have 80, for 2 cells we have 160, and so on and so forth. It gets a little bit more complicated when cells are touching. So if we have a case where 2 cells are touching each other, simple case like this, we've got 2 cells, each of which are touching one other cell. Okay, and for that reason, both cells will be 200% efficient. They'll both generate twice the amount of power, but they'll also both generate 3 times the amount of heat. So we should be expecting 4 times the amount of power, so 4 times 300, so we should be expecting 1,200 arithmetic, and we're expecting 3 times 2 times the original heat, which is 6 times the heat, which is 6 times 80, which is 480. So let's have a look at that. And that's what we get. So you can already possibly start to see that is, oh, and you can also see that the efficiency is 200%. So that's because both of our fuel cells in there have an efficiency of 200. If you have a fuel cell which is touching 2 fuel cell compartments, then the efficiency of this cell will be 300, so it will generate 3 times the power, but it will also generate 6 times the heat. So it will generate a lot more heat. So now we've got efficiency 2, efficiency 2, efficiency 3. So we've got 3 cells with an overall sort of cell power of 7. So we should be expecting 7 times the power, which is 2,100 arithmetic. And then we've got 3, 3, 6, which is 12 times the heat, and 12 times 80 is 1,040, something like that. 960. Okay, I added an extra 80 by accident. And you can see now our efficiency is 233% because we've got 2 200% efficiency cells and 1 300% efficiency cells. And now, as we calculated, we've got 2,100 arithmetic, and we've got 960 heat-metic. If we've, say, got 3, we've now got 4 cells, each touching 2 other cell compartments, so we should be expecting 3, 6, 9, 12 times the power, which is 3,600 arithmetic, and we should now be expecting 24 times the heat. And there we are. If you've got 4, if you've got a cell touching 4 other cells, then the efficiency of this cell is now 4. It generates 4 times the power. Generates 5 times the power. Because it's n plus 1, generates 5 times the power. And it also generates, how much would that generate there? So we've got 1, 3, 6, 10, 15 times the heat. So this one is now generating 5 times the power and 15 times the heat. And there's actually a very simple calculation to work out how much additional energy and additional heat you're going to get. Ooh, that doesn't look very good, does it? I need to fix that. If adjacent to n other cell compartments, it will generate n plus 1 times the power, and n plus 1 times n plus 2 over 2 times the heat. So for example, if we're touching 6 other cells, then we're going to generate 7 times the power, and we're going to generate 7 times 8 over 2, which is 28 times the heat. Okay, so having fuel cells next to each other is a way of increasing the efficiency of your fuels, but it also generates a lot of extra heat which you then have to deal with more coolers. So that's the offset. As for fuel usage, the way you work out fuel usage is you really quite simply just multiply the base fuel usage, which is here. Well, base lifetime. You're given base lifetime. Life rhyme. That's a bit of a typo there I need to fix. So yes, the base lifetime is 1,000 seconds for one base cell, but if you say had 2 cells, then your base lifetime would be 500 seconds. If you had 3 cells, your base lifetime would be 333 seconds. If you had 4 cells, 250, so on and so forth. So you basically just divide this number by the number of cells you have in the reactor. It's as simple as that for the fuel usage, as you would expect. Now moving on to cooling. So let's just have no cells in here just to experiment with the cooling. There are now many different types of coolers. There is standard reactor cooler, which is the original cooler. There is now lots of different types of coolers. Let's have a look at them all. There is the standard cooler, which we know. There is the redstone reactor cooler, cryothium, water, coolant, enderium, glowstone, liquid helium, and the empty one, which is the base one, which you build all the others out of. If you don't have any other mods installed, or if you don't have like thermal expansion or thermal foundation or IC2 installed, then the only options available to you will be the standard one and the water one. If you have IC2 installed, then you'll be able to use the coolant reactor, which is IC2 coolant, which you make from, I believe, distilled water and lapis dust or something like that. And if you've got thermal expansion, then you can use all the cryothium and all that stuff. Each of them have different abilities. Each of them have sort of special uses. So the standard reactor cooler, the recipe for that. So first of all, the recipe for the empty reactor cooler is basic plating and universal reactant. That gives you 16 of them. You can use the assembler, of course. That's a new addition, which we'll get to in the 1.7 update video. We've got an empty reactor cooler. We can use that to make a standard reactor cooler, which is redstone universal reactant in that empty casing. It removes heat from fission reactors. Now each block removes 30 heat per tick. Every block removes 30 heat per tick, but is doubly effective when adjacent to another standard reactor cooler. So if we have, say, just one reactor cooler in here, we see here that it gets rid of 30 heat per tick. But if we have two in here, since they're touching each other, they're both doubly effective, so we should be expecting 4 times the cooling, so 120. And that's what we get. So that's a really good way of cheaply just filling up your reactor with coolant. There's also the water reactor cooler, which is the other option if you don't have any other mods, and that's doubly effective when adjacent to reactor casing. So this is good to have on the outer edges of your reactors, and this doesn't even require any redstone or anything. That just requires water. So since it's on, so if we have it not touching the reactor casing, it generates 30. But if we have it touching the reactor casing, it generates 60, exactly as we expect. So there we are. Now we move on to the other ones. First of all, let's look at the coolant one, which is the IC2 one. The recipe for this is exactly as you expect. Use IC2 coolant. I haven't added a canning machine recipe yet or something like that. I probably should do, considering that you make IC2 coolant in the canning machine. But this has a different ability. So first of all, you can notice that each block actually removes 80 heat per tick by default, and it's doubly effective when adjacent to water. And water is actually something you can put in reactors. It does actually have an effect. So let's have a look at this. So since each one generates 80 heat per tick, removes 80 heat per tick usually, that's 160, but it gets doubled if next to water, so we should be expecting 320, possibly 321 because of the water, yes. Water, by the way, removes 1 heat per tick, as well as generating an extra 1 RF per tick. So it's not brilliant, but it's used to obviously make your coolant reactors, coolant reactor coolers more effective. What else? Okay, let's move on to oh, sorry, I completely forgot about the liquid helium reactor cooler. That's obviously the other option if you're just using nuclear craft. That's made with liquid helium-4, which is obviously made from your helium liquefiers. The use for that is it removes heat from fission reactors. Each block removes a huge 125 heat per tick, so very, very effective, but it cannot be doubled. This number cannot be doubled. It's not affected by the position in the structure, so no matter where it is, it will just generate, it will remove 125 heat per tick. So a very standard but very powerful cooler. Now we move on to all the special thermal expansion coolers, which I think are the cool bits. First of all, we have the redstone reactor cooler. I won't just keep placing them down and breaking the system anymore because it's a bit tedious. Each of these, by the way, the thermal expansion ones as well as the coolant reactor cooler, by default remove 80 heat per tick, but they all have different special abilities. So the redstone reactor cooler is doubly effective when adjacent to a fuel cell compartment. So if it's next to a reactor fuel cell compartment, it will instead remove 160 heat per tick. So good to surround your fuel cells in. Cryothium. It's doubly effective when not adjacent to any other cryothium reactor coolers. So as long as it's not next to another one, it will remove 160 heat per tick. So that's incredibly useful. A really good tactic for cooling is to do a sort of checkerboard pattern with helium and the cryothium. So literally you have the cryothium like this, so that they don't touch each other. and then you fill in the gaps with the liquid helium, and that can give you a huge amount of cooling very, very quickly, as if you do this sort of checkerboard pattern. You'll find that there's actually a lot of quite useful patterns of graphite and coolers, which possibly will become quite popular and sort of mainstream. So there we go, that's the cryothium one. And we've looked at water, we've looked at coolant, you've then got the Enderium. This is doubly effective when adjacent to graphite. If touching a graphite block, then it will be doubly effective, as simple as that. And finally we've got the glowstone one, which is a bit of a loose cannon. This one is quadruply effective, so it will remove 320 heat per tick if adjacent to graphite on all 6 sides. So if it's totally surrounding graphite, it will remove a whopping 320 heat per tick. So that's incredibly useful. And I'm now going to show you another quite common tactic with coolers, which is this one. First of all, you have graphite blocks like this. You have a glowstone reactor cooler surrounded in graphite blocks, as you can see. So that glowstone cooler is going to do a lot of cooling. And then what you do is, next to the graphite blocks, you place Enderium coolers, because they're doubly effective next to graphite. It doesn't matter how many. You just place it like this. Let's not get that one. And then finally you place cryothium around the edges like this. So that's another really, really good way of doing some cooling. That's quite a good little cube, and that's quite useful in reactors which are, say, 9x9, where you can have one of these 3x3 cubes dedicated to your fuel cells, and then the rest of it dedicated with either the sort of checkerboard cooling of helium and cryothium, or the sort of slightly more efficient in terms of power generation graphite and coolant blocks, which is quite nice. So that's another sort of tactic that I like to use when I'm cooling. It's quite an efficient way of doing it, and in quite an efficient way of including graphite in your design, so just randomly placing it everywhere. So there we go, that's all the coolants. The coolants have no effect on power generation or fuel consumption, though. They just have an effect on heat. That's quite important. Then we also have these graphite blocks. We'll get to the speed blocks in a minute because they're a little bit more confusing and a little less intuitive. The graphite blocks are a little bit strange, but again, they're not too bad. The way a graphite block works is that, first of all, it generates, the amount of energy it generates is the base RF of the fuel, the base energy generation of the fuel, regardless of the size of the reactor. And you multiply this by, and by the way, the number of cells that has to actually be in the reactor has to be at least 1. But as you can see here, a graphite block, I'm just reading it off here, the amount of energy it generates is the base RF of the fuel divided by 10 and multiplied by the number of fuel cells you have. So for example, let's just have a look at this case here. So let's just put 1 cell in there for now. I can't remember what the energy and heat generation was. It was 380. And putting 1 graphite block in there, the positioning of the graphite doesn't actually have a bearing on its effectiveness, so don't worry where you put it if you don't want to go for anything specific. You can see now we're generating 310 RF per tick and an extra 20 heat per tick, so an extra 10 RF per tick and an extra 20 heat per tick. Why is that? Well, we want to work out how much extra energy it generates. The amount of extra energy it generates is the base RF, which in LEU's case is 100, divided by 10, which is equal to 10, multiplied by the number of cells, which is 1. So we generate an extra 10 RF per tick. There we are. The amount of extra heat per tick is the base RF, not the base heat, the base RF of the fuel, again, divided by 5 this time, instead of 10, multiplied by the number of cells. And that's why we're generating 20 heat rather than 10, is that we're dividing the base RF by 5 rather than 10. So the amount of heat that each graphite block generates should always be double of the amount of RF that it generates. So there we are. That's quite simple. So that's how graphite works. Then you finally got water, which, while the reactor is off or not online, will simply remove 1 heat per tick, but while it is online, it will also generate 1 heat per tick, so therefore overall generate 0 heat per tick, but will also generate an extra 1 RF per tick. So really only useful in designs where you're including the coolant reactor coolers, really. But it does generate an extra 1 RF per tick if you really care that much about that. Finally, the speed block, which is a little bit less intuitive. This has got quite a random formula. If you put 1 speed block in your reactor, then the extra fuel per tick that is used is 40,000 divided by the multiple of these numbers up here. So in this case it would be 40,000 divided by 9, which is roughly 4,000. And the fuel usage per tick is actually not shown in the GUI. It's actually a percentage, but it doesn't really matter. It's just a formula. The more speed upgrades you put in there, the quicker you're going to run out of fuel. It's as simple as that, and you can experiment around with exactly how many speed upgrades you want. But basically, the more speed upgrades you put in the reactor, the more quickly your fuel's going to deplete. And in bigger reactors, the number of speed upgrades you have to put in there is going to have to increase. So, again, relatively simple. Is that everything for power generation? I think it is, actually. So that's everything. Again, there's always NEI info, so you can always check in the NEI info. If you look at, say, here, you can see that it says here, in a fission reactor, it does it in terms of efficiency sometimes as well, these calculations in these NEI infos. In a fission reactor of C cells and heat level H, each graphite block produces C times 1 plus H over a million divided by 10 times the fuel's base power, and C over 5 times the fuel's base heat, which is not true, so I need to change that as well. So I need to change that. I will get to that in a second. Oh yes, one thing more to say about reactors is if they are heating up, they will generate more power. Up to the point, it's a linear system, so let's just say that it was generating 100 RF per tick at 0 heat. If we're at 50% heat, or I think that's 500,000 heat, then we'd be generating 150 RF per tick. So you just add on the percentage of the heat level. You basically add that on to the power generation. It has no bearing on the fuel usage or the heat production. So for example, if we were to just turn this reactor on with no coolant in it, we would see that the heat level is rising, and we can also see that the RF per tick is rising as well. That's because the heat is rising. So it's just a linear system, as you can see. It's not following any sort of weird formulas. It's increasing at a linear rate. And that really is everything now for power. You can see the efficiency is increasing as well. Another thing to say about the heat generation in fission reactors, the heat generation or the heat level of fission reactors can now be read by a comparator. So if you have just a standard redstone comparator, which is now used in vanilla Minecraft to read how much stuff there is in chests and things, you can now use it to read the heat level of a fission reactor, and it will output a linearly increasing signal up until about 25% heat, which is about here, so I believe that's 250,000 heat, and any heat above 250,000 will emit a full redstone signal. That's a strength of 15, and that will emit a full signal. There's two reasons for this. First of all, I don't want people to just completely fill their reactors with graphite, and therefore just use a comparator which stops the heat from rising at a very high value, so that they can then just fill a reactor with loads and loads of fuel cells, and then generate even more power because of the efficiency increasing with heat. And another reason I want it to be low is for people who do like to use the what some people have now called the pulse reactor design, where you do try to do that. Because of the way that comparators and redstone works, there's actually a slight delay in the signal looping around back into the fission reactor. It's about 4 ticks or so. And so if you have a reactor which is producing any more than 200 if you have a reactor that's producing any more than 200 kiloheat per tick, which is a fifth of the heat capacity per tick, any more than that, and you're probably actually going to blow up your reactor even though it shouldn't have. That's just a problem with redstone. So I highly recommend, if you're going to go for a pulse reactor design, which is entirely possible, people have done it in the past with the old reactors, and I'm sure it's perfectly possible with the new designs, just be very careful not to go over 200 kilo heat per tick, or even less. I would definitely go even less than that. Keep it no more than maybe 100 kilo heat per tick, unless you want a big crater. It's just an unfortunate problem with redstone, and I can't really do anything about it. I know a lot of people, or I say a lot of people, I know a few people don't use comparators. Instead, they literally just use a like something like a ComputerCraft system or a RedNet system or something like that, where you have a very consistent 1 tick redstone pulse every second or something, which stops the reactor from having this problem. So either go below 100 kilo heat per tick for a pulse reactor, or actually use a proper ComputerCraft or RedNet or whatever system to pulse for the right amount of time. Now that's just a warning. So that's everything for reactors. You can put the cells anywhere. There are different types of coolants that are good in different situations. Bigger reactors are better. You can have them of any size, etc, etc. So that's everything about fission. Any questions in the comments? Next video we'll move on to fusion, and first of all look at how it now works with the new electromagnet rings, and perhaps understand why this happened over here, and how you can avoid it from happening to yours. I'll see you then.